Hey everyone, welcome to the channel for another Escape From Tarkov video. In this one, I'm continuing on my series covering the top builds for specific weapons and updating them for the 12.8 patch. This time, taking a look at the 7.62 AKM and AK-103. In the previous patch, these 7.62 AKs had a lot more recoil overall, and even when fully kitted, they couldn't come very close to competing with the other AKs, let alone with other low recoil PvP weapons. During the 12.6 wipe though, these rifles received a significant buff that saw them become pretty much the most used AK variants in one single patch. The 7.62 round might not be as accurate or as fast as the 5.45 AK round, but it packs a pretty mean punch, and the top tier BP ammo is relatively affordable in addition to shredding armor. On top of this, the AK-103, a modernized version of the AKM, got a new compensator in the 12.8 patch that finally lets it compete with the AKM at top tier levels. So now you can make truly awesome builds with either the AKM or the AK-103. So with that intro out of the way, let's start off by taking a look at the budget AKM build using level 2 traders. And at the end of the build, I'll show you how you can set up the same thing on an AK-103. First up for this video, I've got a budget build for the AKM and AK-103 that you can put together once you have level 2 traders unlocked. These are pretty simple builds, and although it's pretty similar on both variants of the 7.62 AK, the AK-103 version comes out with better stats and at a better price, so if you have a choice between the two, I would stick with the AK-103 for the budget build. Both the AKM and AK-103 have about the same price on the flea market of about 40,000 rubles, so we'll be using that for the base weapon cost. Starting from the muzzle, you can get the Zenit DTK1 compensator at skier level 2, which gets you a decent upgrade to recoil control for a good price. The AK-103 can add this by default, but for the AKM, you need the TT AKM adapter from skier level 2. Next up, the handguard on this one is the CAA RS47 handguard, sold by Peacekeeper level 2. This is pretty much the best budget AK handguard, and you don't need any extra rails for it. The grip here is the Zenit RK4, sold by skier level 2, giving you a bit of extra recoil control for a pretty cheap price. And I also add the X400 flashlight or other tactical devices depending on the raid I'm doing. To get a sight onto the AKM, you have a few options, but for this one, I'm using the Bastion dust cover at skier level 2 because it's compatible with pretty much any sight. On this build, I have the Cobra reflex sight from proper level 2, which is one of the cheapest sights in the game, and it also adds a small amount of recoil control, which in my opinion is pretty useful on budget builds with higher recoil. Finally, the last parts are just simple replacements for the wooden stock and pistol grip on the basic AKM. First, the black polymer AK stock from proper level 1, and then the PP19 pistol grip at proper level 2. These parts just add a few extra points to the stats and are basically free once you sell back the old parts to mechanic. You're also going to want to add the GP25 recoil pad to the AK stock, which is a very cheap upgrade to help with recoil control by a pretty significant amount. When this build's all put together, you're looking at 87 recoil and 48 ergonomics for about 94,000 rubles. However, with a few simple changes, you can set this up on an AK-103 with better stats and for a cheaper price overall. The build is almost identical, but you can skip buying the TT AKM adapter for the muzzle device, and you can use the dovetail version of the Cobra reflex sight from proper level 1, which saves you from buying the dust cover for this as well. When you set this up on an AK-103, you get 80 recoil and 55 ergonomics for about 82,000 rubles, which saves you 12,000 altogether and ends up with better recoil and ergonomic stats. Next up for this video, I've got a mid-tier build for the AKM and AK-103 that uses some new attachments added in the 12.8 patch. Personally, I think the mid-range builds for the 7.62 AKs are really where it's at. You have tons of options for parts that can reach these same stats, and you can set up some very competitive builds for under 150k if you have the right parts. For these builds, I'll be starting with the AK-103 setup and then going over what needs to change for the AKM, since I focused on the AKM version in the budget build. Starting from the muzzle, the modern AK variants, including the AK-103, got a new compensator in the 12.8 patch that finally lets them compete with the AKM outside of the budget build. This one is the JMAC RR4D compensator, sold by Mechanic level 3, giving you best in slot recoil stats for the AK-74 and all of the AK-100 rifles. Next up, the handguard on this build is the newly added X47 handguard, which just dropped in the 12.8 patch as well. Statistically, it's very similar to options that were already available, but this one has a really cool feature with the inclusion of a top rail that you can use to mount pretty much any sight sight in the game. This handguard also has rails on it for other attachments, and to start with, I add the Zenit RK1 foregrip from skier level 3 to help cut down on the recoil. I've also added an X400 flashlight onto this one, but feel free to swap this for your preferred attachment. For the sight, like I said, you can just mount it onto the top rail of the handguard, which is fairly low profile, and honestly, it's my new favorite way to mount sights onto AKs. For this build, I've got an EOTech hollow sight off the flea market, which I use as my main general purpose optic. The stock on this build uses a PT lock adapter to add the Zenit PT1 Classica stock, both of these parts sold by skier level 2. You can leave on the default stock with the GP25 butt pad to save a bit of cash, but this upgrade really helps add some extra ergonomics to the build. Finally, the last part that I have on this build is the Zenit RK3 pistol grip, which is sold by skier level 3 and gives you a pretty huge ergonomics boost. When this build is all put together, you're looking at 66 recoil and about 71 ergonomics for a total cost of around 140,000 rubles. I think this build gives you some pretty awesome bang for your buck, and I've been using the AK-103 a lot since the 12.8 patch with this exact build. To set this up on an AKM, you just need to make a few small changes. First up, you need to use the TT AKM adapter to add the JMAC compensator, but it's still the best option for recoil control on a mid-tier build. Next, you need to change the stock on this one to get the same recoil as the AK-103. And on this build, I went with the Zhukov S stock at Peacekeeper level 4. This one is actually the best AK stock in the game and is pretty much the sole reason that the AKM was previously so much better than the AK-103. If you don't have this unlocked, you can also use the Fab Defense UAS AK stock off the flea market, but you're going to lose some recoil stats. When this build is put together, on the AKM you end up with 64 recoil and about 65 ergonomics for 150,000 rubles total. It's a little bit more expensive compared to the AK-103, but you also get slightly less recoil, so it's a small trade-off, and personally I think either of these builds are equally viable. Finally, we come to the top tier recoil focused best in slot build for the AKM and AK-103, which has become very popular among high level players since the AKM was buffed. These builds do some serious work in the right hands, and even though the recoil is still higher compared to other meta builds, 7.62 BP ammo is so cost effective and drops other players so reliably in 2 shots that this build has entered the meta regardless. Before the 12.8 patch, the AKM was much better than the 103 if you set it up at a top tier level, but after the new parts were added, I honestly think the AK-103 competes for that top spot pretty well now. You lose a few points of recoil, but you gain a lot of ergonomics, which is important if you use this build with magnified scopes. For this one, I'll be starting off with the AKM build and then show the changes for the AK-103 setup. Starting at the muzzle, we've got the Lantac Draken compensator, sold by skier level 4. This one is the best in slot option for the AKM with maximum recoil control. The handguard on this build is the VLTOR CMRD handguard, sold by Mechanic level 4, giving you best in slot recoil stats, though at a pretty hefty price. This handguard takes key mod rails to add attachments, so after I add a pair of those, I slap on the Zenit RK2 foregrip for maximum recoil control, and then of course my trusty X400 flashlight and laser combination. An easy swap for this handguard is the Aggressor handguard, also sold by Mechanic level 4, which only loses out on 1% recoil control, but saves you around 11,000 rubles, and you don't need any extra rails to add attachments. To get a sight onto this build, I went with the Fab Defense PDC dust cover, which is kind of an expensive part, but it adds a lot of ergonomics to the build, which I think is pretty useful. For the optic, again, I'm just going with an EOTech hollow sight off the flea market. For the stock on this build, I've got the Zhukov S stock from Peacekeeper level 4, which as I mentioned is a seriously top tier part for any older model AK that it can fit onto. For the pistol grip, this build is swapped over to the Aeronox Scorpius pistol grip, which is sold by Mechanic level 4. This one has the same stats as the RK3, but it's a bit cheaper, so it makes sense to switch it when you unlock it. Finally, the last piece that I add onto this one is the Zenit RP1 charging handle, which gets you a cheap ergonomics boost on any AK. When this build is all put together, you end up with 56 recoil and about 62 ergonomics for around 195,000 rubles total. It's actually quite a bit cheaper than meta builds for something like an M4 or HK, and the recoil is very comfortable even when you're spraying full auto. If you want to build this on an AK-103, the first change you need to make is to add the JMAC RR4D compensator, which is the best option on the AK-103. Next, you just need to change the stock, first by adding a PT lock adapter and then the Zenit PT3 Classica stock from skier level 3. With this build, you get 59 recoil and about 71 ergonomics for around 195,000 rubles total as well. This is the only build that the AK-103 doesn't win on the price point, and even though the recoil is 3 points higher, you gain 10 ergonomics, which helps with faster aiming. Either way you set it up, I think both of these builds seriously are awesome choices if you want to set up a best-in-slot 7.62 AK. Well, that about covers it for these builds for the AKM and AK-103, two rifles that have definitely went from zero to hero in Escape from Tarkov over the last few months. It was honestly like someone flipped a switch after the buff, and these things went from never being used into becoming one of the most used PvP weapons in the game, even at high levels. With the new parts for the AK-103, it can also now compete with the AKM, so I kind of hope to see it floating around out there in raids a bit more once the community figures out that it can now go toe-to-toe with the AKM using pretty much any build. In any case, I hope you found these builds helpful, and let me know what you think down below, plus tell me what weapons you'd like to see me cover next in this series. Thanks for checking out the video. I've got links to my Twitch stream, Discord server, and Patreon page down below for anyone interested, and until next time, stay safe in Tarkov City.